The hospital tent smelled of disinfectant and fear. Sicily, August 1943. Outside, the Mediterranean sun blazed over an island still bleeding from invasion. Inside, rows of wounded men lay on cots, some missing limbs, others staring at canvas ceilings with eyes that had seen too much. General George Patton strode through the entrance, his polished boots clicking against the wooden floorboards, his twin ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips. He was there to inspire his men, to remind them they were warriors in the greatest army the world had ever seen. He moved from bed to bed, offering words of encouragement, his famous gravelly voice carrying across the tent. Then he stopped at a young private sitting on his cot, head in hands, no visible wounds. "What's wrong with you?" George Patton demanded. "It's my nerves, sir," the soldier whispered. "I can't stand the shelling anymore." What happened next would nearly destroy the most aggressive, tactically brilliant general in the American army. George Patton's hand shot out. The slap echoed through the tent like a gunshot. "You're a coward," he roared, his face purple with rage. "You're a disgrace to the army." He struck the soldier again, then grabbed him by the collar, screaming obscenities, calling him yellow, threatening to have him shot. The tent fell silent. Doctors froze. Wounded men, some missing legs, some with bandaged faces, stared in disbelief. The general who had just liberated them was assaulting one of their own. It would happen again days later at another hospital. Another soldier suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Another explosion of rage from George Patton. Another slap heard around the world. When the story broke, it nearly ended his career. Eisenhower, his superior, was forced to issue a humiliating reprimand. The press demanded his removal. Soldiers who had fought under him were divided. Some defended their general's toughness, others were horrified by his cruelty. Politicians in Washington called for his dismissal. And yet, 18 months later, when Adolf Hitler learned that George Patton was commanding troops in Normandy, the Führer would order his entire defensive strategy reoriented. Because Hitler feared George Patton more than any other Allied general. Because George Patton could do what no other commander could: move an entire army across a continent at speeds that defied military logic, strike where the enemy least expected, and shatter defensive lines that others deemed impregnable. This is the paradox of George Patton. A general so brilliant in combat that even his enemies trembled at his name, yet so volatile, so politically tone-deaf, so utterly incapable of compromise that he spent as much energy fighting his own allies as he did fighting the Axis powers. This is not simply the story of World War II's most controversial American general. This is the story of the war inside the war, the hidden conflict that raged behind closed doors, intense meetings and furious telegrams, between George Patton and the very men who were supposed to be fighting alongside him. Eisenhower, who both needed and feared him. Montgomery, who despised and competed with him. Bradley, who had once been his subordinate and became his superior, carrying scars from their relationship that would last a lifetime. How does a man win battles while losing the trust of everyone around him? How does genius coexist with self-destruction? How does a warrior built for conquest survive in an age that requires diplomacy? The answers lie not just in the battles George Patton won, but in the wars he fought against the very people who should have been his brothers in arms. This is that story, of brilliance and madness, of victory and tragedy, of a man born for war who could never find peace. The tent in Sicily was just the beginning. The real battle, the one that would define George Patton's legacy and haunt the Allied command for the rest of the war, was only starting to unfold. To understand the collision that was coming, you must first understand the man, and the world he was about to tear through. George Patton was born into war before he ever saw a battlefield. Not the war of nations, but the war of legacy, of bloodlines that stretched back through American history like a red thread of violence and honor. His grandfather had died fighting for the Confederacy. His family spoke of military glory the way others spoke of religion. Young George grew up surrounded by tales of cavalry charges and last stands, of men who chose death over dishonor. But George Patton believed he had lived those stories himself. He was convinced, genuinely, deeply convinced, that he had fought in previous lives. He claimed to remember being a Greek hoplite at the siege of Troy, a Roman legionnaire under Caesar, a soldier in Napoleon's Grande Army. He would visit battlefields in France and describe terrain he had never seen before with eerie accuracy, insisting he had died there centuries ago. To George Patton, war was not politics by other means. It was his destiny, his religion, his reason for existence. He read military history obsessively. He could quote Napoleon, study Alexander, analyze Hannibal's tactics with scholarly precision. He designed new cavalry sabers, pioneered American tank doctrine, and spent the years between the world wars preparing for a conflict he knew was coming. While other officers grew soft in peacetime posts, George Patton trained, studied, and waited for his moment. He was theatrical, bombastic, profane. He cultivated his image carefully, the ivory-handled revolvers, not pearl as he once snapped. Only pimps and prostitutes carry pearl-handled guns. The perfectly tailored uniforms, the mirrored helmet that caught the sun like a beacon. He wanted his men to see him and feel invincible. He wanted his enemies to hear his name and feel fear. He spoke to his soldiers in language that would make a longshoreman blush, crude and raw and honest. "We're not just going to shoot the bastards," he told them before battle. "We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." His men loved him for it. He didn't speak like a general. He spoke like he would kill or die beside them. But George Patton, for all his genius, had a fatal flaw. He would not play politics. He saw military objectives with crystalline clarity but was blind to the political realities that governed modern warfare. He believed in victory through aggression, in speed and violence of action, in the doctrine that it was better to risk everything than to wait cautiously. He had no patience for diplomacy, coalition building, or compromise. And in World War II, those things mattered more than they ever had before. Because this was not a war America could fight alone. This was coalition warfare on an unprecedented scale, a massive alliance of nations with competing interests, fragile egos, and fundamentally different military philosophies. Managing this coalition would require a different kind of general, a political general, a diplomat in uniform. That general was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had never commanded troops in combat when he was elevated to Supreme Allied Commander. His genius lay not in tactics but in something far more difficult: holding the alliance together. The Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, and dozens of smaller nations all had to coordinate, cooperate, and somehow avoid tearing each other apart. Eisenhower's battlefield was the conference room, his weapons were compromise and charm, and his greatest victories were the crises he prevented rather than the battles he won. He was a Midwesterner with a broad smile and an ability to make people feel heard even when he disagreed with them. He navigated between Churchill and Roosevelt, between American industrial might and British imperial pride, between generals with massive egos and politicians with impossible demands. He carried the weight of millions of lives and the fate of civilization on his shoulders, and he could never, ever show how crushing that burden was. Eisenhower needed aggressive, brilliant field commanders. He needed men who could win battles. But he also needed men who understood that winning the war required more than tactical brilliance. It required keeping the alliance intact. George Patton would never understand that. And it would nearly destroy them both. Then there was Bernard Montgomery, the British field marshal who would become George Patton's greatest rival. Monty was everything George Patton was not: methodical, cautious, obsessed with preparation and overwhelming force. He would not attack until every detail was planned, every supply line secured, every contingency prepared for. He was arrogant in a particularly British way, convinced of his own superiority and unable to hide his contempt for American military amateurism. Montgomery had earned his reputation in North Africa, where he defeated Rommel at El Alamein and became Britain's first battlefield hero of the war. The British press treated him like a savior. Churchill needed him as a symbol of British resilience. And Montgomery believed his own press. He saw himself as the natural overall ground commander for any operation, with Americans playing a supporting role. George Patton and Montgomery were oil and water, fire and ice. Both were egomaniacs, both craved glory, both saw war as a personal test of greatness. But where George Patton was instinctive and aggressive, Montgomery was calculating and methodical. Where George Patton sought breakthrough and exploitation, Montgomery sought overwhelming force and set-piece battles. They were destined to clash not just strategically, but personally, viscerally, in ways that would cost lives and nearly fracture the alliance. And finally there was Omar Bradley, steady, competent, understated Bradley. He had been George Patton's junior officer, his subordinate, someone who learned tactics at George Patton's knee. But Bradley had something George Patton lacked: political intelligence. He understood how to work within the system, how to get along with allies, how to voice disagreements without causing explosions. Eisenhower trusted Bradley. When Eisenhower needed someone who could command American armies without creating diplomatic incidents, he chose Bradley. Which meant that George Patton, the tactical genius, the warrior who had trained Bradley, would now serve under his former student. The humiliation burned. George Patton would never say it directly, but his diary entries dripped with resentment. Bradley, in turn, would spend the rest of his life justifying decisions that kept George Patton on a leash, defending himself against the charge that he was too cautious, too political, too willing to sacrifice boldness for safety. This was the chessboard: Eisenhower trying to hold an alliance together, Montgomery fighting for British primacy and personal glory, Bradley trying to prove American competence while managing an unmanageable subordinate, and George Patton, brilliant, reckless, indispensable, and impossible, who believed that war was simple: find the enemy and destroy him, and everything else was just cowardice dressed up as caution. They were about to invade Europe. They were about to liberate a continent. They were about to defeat Nazi Germany. But first they would have to survive each other. The stage was set. The pieces were in position. And in North Africa, where the American army was about to face its first real test against German forces, the fault lines were already beginning to show. George Patton was coming, and nothing, not the enemy, not his allies, not even his own army, was ready for the storm he would bring. February 1943. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The American army was being slaughtered. German panzers rolled through American defensive positions like they were made of paper. Inexperienced American troops broke and ran. Officers lost control of their units. Equipment was abandoned. In the span of days, the United States suffered its most humiliating defeat of World War II, a complete, devastating rout that sent soldiers streaming backward in panic and exposed American military incompetence to the world. Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had struck the Americans hard and proven what many had suspected. The Americans were amateurs, unprepared for real warfare, and perhaps incapable of standing against German military excellence. In the aftermath, as body counts were tallied and the extent of the disaster became clear, Eisenhower faced a crisis. The American II Corps, bloodied and demoralized, needed a leader who could restore discipline, rebuild confidence, and prove that American forces could fight. He needed someone aggressive, demanding, who would rather be feared than loved. He needed George Patton. George Patton arrived like a force of nature. He immediately imposed draconian discipline on the II Corps. Soldiers not wearing helmets? Fought. Officers not in proper uniform? Relieved of command. Vehicles not properly maintained? Commanders faced courts-martial. He was everywhere, appearing suddenly at checkpoints, berating soldiers for slovenly appearance, making examples of anyone who showed the slightest lack of military bearing. His soldiers hated him. They called him old blood and guts. Yeah, our blood and his guts. But they also stopped looking defeated. They stood straighter. They started acting like soldiers instead of refugees. And then George Patton showed them what they could do. In a series of sharp, aggressive actions, George Patton's II Corps attacked German positions with a ferocity that shocked both allies and enemies. He didn't wait for perfect conditions or overwhelming force. He struck hard, struck fast, and kept moving. His instinct for terrain and timing was uncanny. He seemed to know where the enemy was weak before intelligence reports confirmed it. He pushed his commanders relentlessly, relieving those who hesitated, promoting those who showed aggression. The American army learned to fight. More importantly, they learned to win. But even in victory, the seeds of conflict were being planted. Montgomery, commanding British forces in the same theater, was pursuing Rommel's retreating forces with his characteristic methodical approach. And George Patton was about to make it personal. The invasion of Sicily, July 1943, was supposed to be a coordinated Allied operation. Montgomery would take the primary route along the eastern coast toward Messina, the ultimate objective. American forces under George Patton would support on the western flank, protecting Montgomery's advance. It was a sensible plan that reflected British seniority and Montgomery's reputation. George Patton hated everything about it. He saw it as relegating American forces to a secondary role, making them Montgomery's servants rather than equal partners. Worse, he saw it as strategically stupid, giving Montgomery the glory while American soldiers did the hard, thankless work of flank protection. So George Patton decided to make his own plan. Without explicit authorization, he drove his 7th Army north at breakneck speed, racing toward Messina through some of the most difficult terrain in Sicily. His troops advanced so fast that supply lines could barely keep up. He drove his commanders to exhaustion, accepting casualties that others deemed excessive, all with one goal: beat Montgomery to Messina. It became a race. Montgomery, realizing what George Patton was doing, tried to accelerate his own advance. But British caution and methodical preparation couldn't match American speed and recklessness. George Patton's tanks and infantry clawed their way through mountains and coastal roads, sometimes covering 50 miles in a day when 20 was considered excellent progress. On August 17, 1943, George Patton's forces entered Messina first. He stood in the city square, grinning, waiting for Montgomery to arrive. When British forces finally appeared hours later, George Patton greeted them with theatrical courtesy. "What delayed you?" Montgomery was furious. Eisenhower was furious. The entire carefully managed alliance protocol had been violated because George Patton couldn't resist turning a military operation into a personal competition. Staff officers on both sides exchanged bitter memos about recklessness, about violations of command structure, about American cowboys and British stuffed shirts. But Sicily was liberated. And George Patton was a hero to American newspapers and soldiers alike. He had proven American forces could not just fight but excel. He had humiliated the British and their vaunted field marshal. He had shown that aggressive warfare, speed, and audacity could achieve what caution never would. He had also shown he was willing to disregard orders, risk lives for glory, and turn alliance partners into rivals. And then came the hospital incidents. The slapping of the soldiers, Private Charles H. Cole and Private Paul G. Bennett, happened in the midst of George Patton's greatest triumph. Both men were suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, or shell shock, what we now recognize as combat trauma. To George Patton, who believed that fear was something to be conquered through willpower and that mental weakness was as contemptible as physical cowardice, these men represented everything wrong with modern soldiers. His rage was genuine. In his mind, while brave men were dying on the front lines, these cowards were sitting safely in hospitals claiming nervous conditions. He saw it as a betrayal of those fighting, a cancer that would spread if not cut out immediately. So he struck them. He called them yellow. He threatened them with execution. He made a spectacle of his contempt. The story, when it leaked weeks later, exploded across American newspapers. Editorial writers demanded his removal. Congressional representatives questioned his fitness for command. Soldiers who admired his toughness were forced to confront his cruelty. Soldiers who feared combat trauma saw themselves in those slapped men and recoiled from their general. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Fire George Patton and lose his most aggressive, successful field commander, a general the Germans actually feared. Or keep him and damage the alliance, demoralize troops, and face political firestorm at home. Eisenhower chose a middle path that would define their relationship for the rest of the war. He would keep George Patton, but on a tight leash. He ordered George Patton to apologize publicly to both soldiers, to the hospital staff, and to his entire command. The apology tour was humiliating. George Patton standing before formations of thousands of troops, choking out words of regret, his face flushed with shame and anger. But he would not command in the initial assault on Fortress Europe. When D-Day came, when the most important invasion in human history was launched, George Patton would be deliberately left behind. The general who had just liberated Sicily, who had rebuilt American morale, who had proven himself the most aggressive commander in the Allied arsenal, would sit on the sidelines while others earned glory. Eisenhower needed George Patton. But Eisenhower also feared what George Patton would do if given free rein. Montgomery despised George Patton's recklessness and resented his glory-seeking. Bradley, now elevated above his former commander, carried the complicated burden of managing a man who had once been his mentor and was now his most talented, most dangerous subordinate. The war in Europe was about to begin. And the war inside the war, between George Patton and everyone else, was already at full boil. North Africa and Sicily had proven George Patton's battlefield genius. They had also proven he was, in many ways, uncontrollable. The question facing Allied command was not whether they needed George Patton. They absolutely did. The question was whether they could afford him. The answer would come in the fields of France, in the forests of Belgium, at the frozen crossroads of Bastogne, and ultimately on the banks of the Elbe River where American and Soviet forces would meet. But first, George Patton would have to endure the greatest humiliation of his career, commanding an army that didn't exist, while younger generals led the invasion he had trained his entire life to lead. The war inside the war was only beginning. And before it ended, it would nearly tear the Allied command apart. Imagine being the most feared general in the European theater, and being told you will command nothing. Spring 1944. While the greatest invasion in military history was being prepared, while thousands of ships gathered in British ports, while paratroopers trained for drops behind enemy lines, while the fate of Western civilization hung on the success of Operation Overlord, George Patton sat in England commanding an army that did not exist. The first United States Army Group, FUSAG, was a phantom, a fiction, an elaborate deception designed to convince Hitler that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. And George Patton, the general who craved action above all else, was the centerpiece of this massive lie. The irony was almost poetic. George Patton's reputation had become so fearsome, his tactical genius so acknowledged, that even his enemies believed he would lead the invasion. German intelligence was certain of it. Hitler was certain of it. Where George Patton was positioned, that's where the Allies would strike. It was simple military logic. So the Allies positioned him opposite Pas-de-Calais, the closest point between England and France, the most obvious invasion route. They surrounded him with fake equipment. Rubber tanks, plywood landing craft, dummy airfields with aircraft that couldn't fly. They generated false radio traffic, created fabricated supply movements, and had George Patton make highly visible inspections of units that existed only on paper. Operation Fortitude, as the deception was codenamed, worked beyond anyone's expectations. Even after D-Day, even after Allied forces were dying on the beaches of Normandy, Hitler kept elite panzer divisions at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for George Patton's real invasion. The Phantom Army held German reserves away from the actual battle for weeks, saving countless Allied lives. But for George Patton it was torture. He sat in headquarters reading reports of the Normandy invasion, watching other generals, younger generals, less experienced generals, leading the assault he should have commanded. Bradley, his former subordinate, was now leading U.S. ground forces. Montgomery was overall ground commander. And George Patton was playing pretend with fake tanks. His diary entries from this period are heartbreaking. He wrote of feeling useless, of watching his career evaporate while others earned glory. He raged against the politicians and the timid generals who had sidelined him. He fell into dark moods, convinced that the war would be won without him, that history would forget his name, that his destiny was being stolen by lesser men. He had nightmares about dying in peacetime, never having fulfilled his purpose. To George Patton, who believed he had been reborn through centuries specifically to fight in the great wars of history, sitting idle while the greatest battle of the age was fought without him was worse than death. His wife Beatrice received letters filled with barely concealed depression. "I am in the doghouse," he wrote with his characteristic bluntness. He begged Eisenhower for any command, any role in the actual fighting. He promised to behave, to follow orders, to keep his mouth shut, promises everyone knew he couldn't keep. But the punishment served multiple purposes. Yes, it kept George Patton's tendency for controversy away from the most politically sensitive operation of the war. Yes, it exploited his reputation for the deception plan. But it also sent a message to all Allied commanders. No one, not even the most brilliant general, was indispensable. No one was above the alliance. No one could act like a lone wolf and expect to lead. The psychological effect on George Patton was profound. The man who had spent his entire life preparing for war, who believed in destiny and reincarnation and the glory of combat, was forced to confront his own vulnerability. He was 58 years old. This was likely his last war. And he was being left behind. He channeled his frustration into meticulous planning for what would come after. If he got another chance, if they unleashed him in France, he would show them what real warfare looked like. He studied maps obsessively, memorized terrain, planned advance routes before anyone told him where he would be deployed. He trained his staff, refined his tactics, and prepared for a campaign of movement and aggression that would make his Sicily operation look cautious. And something else happened during those months of exile. George Patton, perhaps for the first time in his career, learned to manage his public persona more carefully. Not completely, he would never be diplomatic, but he began to understand that his enemies were not just across the battlefield. They were in conference rooms, reading his statements, looking for reasons to sideline him permanently. He gave fewer inflammatory interviews. He apologized more quickly when he caused offense. He learned, however imperfectly, that in modern coalition warfare, a general had to be more than just a tactician. He had to be politically survivable. The invasion of Normandy launched on June 6, 1944. American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches under withering fire. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Naval guns pounded German fortifications. Men died by the thousands, establishing a fragile foothold on Hitler's fortress Europe. And George Patton sat in England, commanding his ghost army, wondering if he would ever get another chance. But in German headquarters, in the reinforced bunkers where Hitler and his generals studied maps and moved divisions, the fear of George Patton remained. They saw the Phantom Army. They tracked the fake radio signals. They believed the deception. And they kept two powerful panzer divisions at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for George Patton to strike. Those divisions could have slaughtered American troops at Omaha Beach. They could have thrown the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they sat idle, waiting for a ghost army that would never come, paralyzed by the reputation of a general who wasn't even there. In the cruelest twist of irony, George Patton's exile may have been his greatest contribution to D-Day's success. His reputation, his fearsome image, his carefully cultivated persona as the Allies' most aggressive general, all of it became a weapon that saved lives even while the man himself sat powerless and frustrated hundreds of miles from the fighting. On July 6, 1944, exactly 1 month after D-Day, George Patton finally received his orders. He would take command of the newly activated Third Army. He would join the battle in France. The Phantom Army would dissolve, and the real army, George Patton's army, would be unleashed on the German forces holding Normandy. The exile was over. The real war, George Patton's war, was about to begin. And when it did, when George Patton finally got his chance to show what aggressive, mobile warfare could accomplish, he would vindicate every controversial decision, every inflammatory statement, every moment of frustration during his exile. He would prove that his tactical genius was worth all the trouble he caused. But he would also prove that his inability to work within the alliance structure, his need for personal glory, his contempt for caution and compromise, would create conflicts with his fellow generals that threatened to undermine the very victories he was winning. The Phantom Army had worked because George Patton was sidelined. The question now was whether unleashing him would save the Allied advance, or tear it apart from within. The answer would come in the killing fields of France, in a race for glory that would pit American against British, general against general, and ego against ego, while German soldiers fought desperately to hold back the Allied tide. George Patton was no longer a phantom. He was real, he was angry, and he was about to show the world what he could do. August 1, 1944. The Third Army became operational. And George Patton exploded across France like a force of nature that had been bottled up too long. Operation Cobra had just shattered German defenses at the western edge of the Normandy lodgment. American forces had finally broken through the hedgerows that had turned the Norman countryside into a bloody stalemate. Now there was open country ahead, and George Patton had an entire army of tanks, artillery, and infantry ready to exploit it. What happened next redefined the possible in modern warfare. The Third Army didn't advance. It erupted. George Patton's armored columns moved so fast that German commanders couldn't track them. Towns that were supposed to take days to capture fell in hours. Defensive lines that should have held for weeks collapsed overnight. The German Seventh Army, which had fought the Allies to a standstill for 2 months, suddenly found American tanks appearing in their rear, cutting supply lines, capturing headquarters before orders could be issued. George Patton drove his commanders mercilessly. "I don't want any messages saying, 'I am holding my position,'" he told them. "We're not holding anything. Let the Hun do that. We are advancing constantly." Sleep was a luxury. Caution was cowardice. Every hour spent not moving forward was an hour wasted. His army covered distances that military analysts deemed impossible. 30 miles in a day. 50 miles. 60. Supply officers tore their hair out trying to keep fuel and ammunition flowing to units that were advancing faster than trucks could deliver. George Patton didn't care. "My men can eat their belts," he said, "but my tanks have got to have gas." The sweep across France was intoxicating. American flags flew over towns that had been under Nazi occupation for 4 years. French civilians poured into streets, weeping and cheering. German soldiers surrendered in such numbers that George Patton's army couldn't process them all. Entire units were simply disarmed and told to march east toward POW camps without guards. By late August, the Third Army had advanced over 400 miles in less than a month. They had liberated vast swaths of France, inflicted catastrophic casualties on German forces, and established George Patton as exactly what he had always claimed to be, the finest offensive general in the Allied arsenal. But speed requires fuel. And fuel was running out. The logistical situation facing the Allied armies in late summer 1944 was unprecedented. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every can of food for millions of soldiers had to travel from ports in Normandy through a transportation network that was barely functioning. The Allies had advanced so quickly that they had outrun their supply lines. Trucks were making round trips of hundreds of miles. The Red Ball Express, convoys of supply trucks operating 24 hours a day, was performing logistical miracles, but it wasn't enough. There simply wasn't enough fuel to supply every Allied army at full operational capacity. And that meant someone had to be given priority. Someone had to receive the fuel needed to continue advancing. And someone had to be told to slow down, to wait, to let others have first draw on limited resources. This is where military strategy became personal rivalry. This is where the war inside the war moved from simmering tension to open conflict. George Patton believed he should get the fuel. His logic was simple and, from a purely tactical standpoint, compelling. His Third Army was advancing faster than any other Allied force. He was deep in German-held territory, capturing objectives ahead of schedule, keeping the enemy off balance. Give him the supplies, he argued, and he could drive all the way to the German border, possibly even into Germany itself before winter. He could end the war in 1944. We should cross the Rhine in 10 days, he told anyone who would listen. Just give me the fuel and I'll have us in Berlin by Christmas. Montgomery believed he should get the fuel. His logic was different but equally compelling from a strategic standpoint. A narrow thrust by concentrated forces could drive through the Netherlands, cross the Rhine at its narrowest point, sweep around the Ruhr industrial region, and strike into the heart of Germany. His forces were positioned perfectly for this operation. Give him priority, he argued, and he could deliver a knockout blow. A single concentrated thrust, Montgomery insisted, is worth 10 scattered advances. Bradley, commanding the entire U.S. Army Group, had his own perspective. He wanted to advance on a broad front, maintaining pressure everywhere, never allowing the Germans to concentrate their forces. It was methodical, it minimized risk, and it reflected American preference for overwhelming force rather than surgical strikes. And Eisenhower, caught in the middle, had to choose. The decision he made would become one of the most controversial of the entire war. And it would ignite a conflict between George Patton and Montgomery that nearly fractured the alliance. Eisenhower chose the broad front strategy. Every army would advance, but no single commander would receive priority for supplies. Resources would be distributed to maintain pressure across the entire front. George Patton was apoplectic. He saw it as timidity, as Eisenhower refusing to make the tough call, as allowing political concerns about Anglo-American balance to override sound military strategy. "Ike is unwilling to give me priority," he raged in his diary. "He has no idea how fast we could move if we had the fuel." But then Eisenhower made a concession to Montgomery. For one specific operation, a bold airborne assault across the Rhine, Montgomery would receive supply priority. Operation Market Garden would be the focused thrust Montgomery had been demanding. And George Patton's Third Army would have to halt. The order came down in early September. Third Army was to cease major offensive operations. They were to consolidate positions, rest troops, and wait for supplies. They had advanced further and faster than any army in modern warfare, and now they were being told to stop just as momentum was building. George Patton's fury was volcanic. He ranted to his staff about the greatest mistake of the war. He accused Eisenhower of being Montgomery's puppet. He claimed that political considerations, keeping the British happy, were being placed above military victory. He wrote letters that his staff wisely prevented him from sending, letters that bordered on insubordination. But what enraged him most was the unfairness he perceived. Montgomery, cautious Montgomery, was being given priority for an operation that George Patton considered overly complex and risky. Meanwhile, his own proven method, fast, aggressive pursuit of a retreating enemy, was being starved of resources. The personal dimension became toxic. George Patton had already disliked Montgomery since their race to Messina. Now that dislike curdled into something deeper. He mocked Montgomery's caution in meetings. He complained bitterly about British demands for priority. He made it clear to anyone who would listen that he considered Montgomery a military mediocrity coasting on reputation and political connections. Montgomery, for his part, viewed George Patton as a dangerous cowboy whose reckless advances were strategically meaningless without proper objectives and consolidation. He wrote dismissively of American tendency to charge off in all directions without proper planning. The British press, always defensive of Montgomery, portrayed George Patton as a glory hound more interested in headlines than victory. The fuel crisis of September 1944 crystallized everything that would plague Allied command for the rest of the war. The tension between concentrated thrust and broad advance, the conflict between tactical brilliance and strategic coherence, the personal rivalries between commanders who should have been brothers in arms. Bradley, caught between his former mentor and his British counterpart, tried to maintain equilibrium. But even he grew frustrated with George Patton's constant demands, his unwillingness to accept limitations, his tendency to disobey orders when he thought he could get away with it. "George will try anything once," Bradley said, with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "Getting him to follow orders is like trying to push a rope." While the generals fought over fuel, soldiers sat idle. George Patton's Third Army, which had been a rolling thunder across France, ground to a halt on the Moselle River. German forces, given precious time to regroup, began reinforcing defensive lines. The opportunity for pursuit, for catching the enemy before they could establish new positions, slipped away day by day. And in the Netherlands, Montgomery was preparing Operation Market Garden, the operation that had been given the fuel and supply priority that George Patton had been denied. It would fail catastrophically. And George Patton would never, ever let Montgomery forget it. The fuel crisis didn't just slow the Allied advance. It poisoned relationships, created resentments that would last decades, and raised questions that military historians still debate. What if George Patton had been given full supply priority? Could he really have reached Germany before winter? Or would his army have outrun its supplies completely and been destroyed by German counterattacks? What if Montgomery's narrow thrust concept had been fully supported instead of being a half measure? Could Market Garden have succeeded with more resources? Or was Eisenhower right that the broad front advance, for all its frustrations, was the only strategy that kept the alliance intact and guaranteed eventual victory? The questions are unanswerable. But the consequences were real. Soldiers who could have been advancing were sitting still. Germans who could have been captured were escaping to fight another day. And the war, which might have ended in 1944, would drag on through a brutal winter and into 1945. All because there wasn't enough fuel, and because the generals who were supposed to be fighting together couldn't agree on who should get it. George Patton would eventually get moving again. His Third Army would resume its advance, would fight through some of the most brutal combat of the war, would vindicate his aggressive tactics time and again. But the fuel crisis of September 1944, and the conflicts it exposed, would shadow every decision for the rest of the war. The trust between commanders, already fragile, was damaged in ways that would never fully heal. The war inside the war had reached a new level. And the worst was yet to come. The generals fought over maps and fuel allocations in headquarters hundreds of miles from the front. But the soldiers, the men who actually did the fighting, the dying, the bleeding, experienced these command conflicts in very different ways. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, serving in the Pacific, would later write that he never knew the names of the generals commanding his operations until after the war. The strategic decisions, the personality conflicts, the grand debates, none of it touched him in his foxhole. But in Europe, where the war was followed by every newspaper, where personalities were larger than life, the soldiers knew their generals. And they had opinions. Patton was a son of a bitch, wrote Lieutenant Paul Fussell, who served in the infantry under George Patton's command. But he was our son of a bitch. The sentiment was common. George Patton's soldiers complained about his rigid discipline, his obsession with proper uniforms even in combat zones, his willingness to accept casualties that other generals might have avoided. They resented being fined for not wearing ties in rear areas. They hated his profanity-laced speeches that treated them like instruments of violence rather than human beings. But they also took fierce pride in being part of his army. The Third Army had a reputation. When German prisoners were asked which Allied unit they most feared, they said George Patton's name. That meant something to the soldiers wearing the Third Army patch. It meant they were the tip of the spear. It meant they were winning. Staff Sergeant Henry Giles wrote home to his wife in September 1944, during the fuel shortage, "We were moving so fast the Krauts couldn't keep up with where we were. Now we're sitting on our asses while the British get first crack at supplies. The men are angry. We could have kept going. We could have ended this thing." The perception, fair or not, was that American aggressiveness was being throttled to accommodate British pride. And that perception affected morale in ways the generals never fully understood. But there was another side to the story. Corporal James Pemberton, serving in an armored unit, wrote a letter that his family only discovered decades later. "Patton drives us like machines. Yesterday we lost 3 tanks because he ordered us forward without proper reconnaissance. The crews burned to death. All because he wanted to take a town by nightfall to impress some visiting brass. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers we're human." The casualties George Patton accepted in pursuit of speed and momentum were real. Soldiers knew that serving under George Patton meant being pushed to exhaustion, being committed to attacks that other commanders might have delayed for better preparation, being expected to do the impossible on a regular basis. One anonymous soldier, in a letter that appeared in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, wrote, "They talk about Patton being a genius. Maybe he is. But geniuses don't have to pick up pieces of their friends and put them in body bags." The resentment wasn't universal. Many soldiers admired George Patton's aggression and believed that speed saved lives by keeping the enemy off balance. But the cost was undeniable. The Third Army's casualty rates were high, even by the brutal standards of World War II. And when soldiers learned that the Third Army had been halted for supply reasons while Montgomery received priority for Market Garden, The anger was visceral. They had been advancing successfully. They had momentum. And they were being stopped so British forces could launch an operation that many American soldiers viewed with skepticism. "We're winning our war," one soldier told a war correspondent, but losing the argument back at headquarters. From the British perspective, the conflict looked entirely different. Sergeant William Mayhew, serving in Montgomery's 21st Army Group, wrote, "The Americans think war is a race. They charge forward without proper planning, without securing flanks, without establishing proper supply lines. Then they wonder why they run out of fuel and have to stop. Montgomery plans operations properly. We move when we're ready, not before." The British soldiers had fought longer than the Americans. They had endured Dunkirk, the Blitz, years of rationing and sacrifice. Many viewed American complaints about supply shortages with contempt. The Americans had everything, they had industrial might beyond imagining, and still they complained. "They have more of everything than we ever did," Mayhew continued, "and they act like they're being cheated if they don't get absolute priority for every operation." The cultural divide was real. British soldiers valued discipline, proper procedure, and respect for rank. George Patton's army, for all its fighting effectiveness, struck many British soldiers as chaotic and undisciplined. American informality, the way officers and enlisted men spoke to each other, the casualness of American military culture, seemed unprofessional. And when Market Garden failed, when British and Polish paratroopers were slaughtered at Arnhem, when the operation that had been given supply priority ended in catastrophic defeat, American soldiers didn't hide their anger. "We were told to sit still so Monty could have his big operation," wrote Sergeant Robert Hogan. "Then he screwed it up. Those British paratroopers died because of bad planning, but we're the ones who lost the time we could have been advancing. How many Americans will die this winter because we didn't finish the war in September?" The bitterness was mutual. British soldiers pointed out that American advances, for all their speed, often left German units intact to fight another day. Montgomery's methodical approach destroyed enemy units completely. Speed meant nothing if it didn't achieve strategic objectives. But beneath the tactical arguments, beneath the debates about operational strategy, was something more human. Soldiers on both sides felt that their generals' egos were costing lives. Captain Daniel Shepard, an American staff officer, wrote a brutally honest letter that he never sent. "The generals are fighting each other as much as they're fighting the Germans. Patton wants glory. Montgomery wants vindication. Eisenhower wants everyone to get along. And we're the ones who bleed for their pissing contests." The soldiers trapped in the Falaise pocket in August 1944 experienced this conflict in the most direct way possible. German forces were retreating through a narrow gap between American and British/Canadian forces. If the gap closed quickly, an entire German army could be destroyed. But coordination between George Patton's forces advancing from the south and Montgomery's forces pushing from the north was poor. George Patton wanted to close the gap himself, to trap the Germans completely. But he was ordered to stop at a boundary line to avoid confusion with Canadian forces advancing from the north. The boundary was political as much as military, ensuring that British Commonwealth forces shared in the victory. Thousands of German soldiers escaped through the gap. They would fight again in the winter. They would kill Allied soldiers in the Hurtgen Forest, at the Battle of the Bulge, during the final defense of Germany. Sergeant Michael Torres, who fought in the Falaise area, wrote, "We could see them escaping. We could have closed the trap. But we weren't allowed to cross the line. Some boundary on a map that Brass drew up was more important than finishing the job. Men will die later because of decisions made here." Not all soldier perspectives were negative. Many recognized the impossibility of Eisenhower's position, the necessity of keeping the alliance together, the reality that coalition warfare required compromises that purely military thinking didn't account for. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Norton, a battalion commander, reflected, "Easy for Patton to demand all the fuel. Easy for Montgomery to insist he's right. But someone has to balance American and British interests, keep the French happy, coordinate with the Russians, and somehow defeat Germany. I don't envy Eisenhower. Every decision he makes pisses off someone." And some soldiers saw George Patton's conflicts with other generals as a positive. In their view, someone needed to fight for aggressive tactics, someone needed to push against excessive caution, someone needed to remind headquarters that winning battles required taking risks. "If Patton wasn't raising hell," said one soldier in an oral history recorded decades later, "we'd probably still be sitting in Normandy waiting for perfect conditions that would never come." Sometimes you need a general who's willing to be a pain in the ass. But the letters home, the diary entries, the private conversations between soldiers all reveal a deep frustration. the sense that the men actually doing the fighting were caught in the middle of conflicts between generals who were supposed to be on the same side. Private Kenneth Davis wrote to his brother, "The Germans are our enemy. But sometimes I think our own generals are fighting each other more than they're fighting the Nazis. We win battles in spite of them, not because of them." The human cost of command conflict wasn't just measured in battles lost or opportunities missed. It was measured in trust eroded, morale damaged, and the bitter knowledge that soldiers had that their lives were being wagered in games of ego and pride that had nothing to do with defeating the enemy. Years later, veterans from both sides of the Atlantic would gather at reunions and share their experiences. British and American soldiers who had viewed each other with suspicion during the war developed friendships, learned to appreciate each other's contributions, and came to understand that they had all been caught in forces larger than themselves. But they also acknowledged something that the generals never fully admitted: the conflicts at the top filtered down. The rivalries, the competition for resources and glory, the failure to coordinate, all of it affected the men in foxholes, the tank crews, the infantrymen who had to execute plans made by commanders who couldn't agree on basic strategy. "We fought 2 wars, one veteran said simply. The one against the Germans, which we won, and the one between our own generals, which never really ended." The voices from the ranks don't provide easy answers about who was right. George Patton with his aggressive pursuit, Montgomery with his methodical planning, or Eisenhower with his compromise approach. But they remind us that behind every strategic decision, every supply allocation, every boundary line on a map, there were human beings whose lives hung in the balance. And those human beings knew, even if they couldn't always articulate it, that the war inside the war was costing them dearly. They deserved better. They deserved generals who could channel their brilliance into cooperation rather than competition. They deserved leaders who remembered that the point wasn't personal glory but victory and survival. But war brings out both the best and worst in human nature. And the soldiers of World War II experienced both, often simultaneously, from the very men who were supposed to lead them to victory. September 17, 1944. The largest airborne operation in history began. Thousands of paratroopers and glider-borne infantry descended on the Netherlands in a single day. American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. British 1st Airborne Division. Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade. Over 35,000 men dropping from the sky to seize bridges across major rivers. The key to Montgomery's bold plan to outflank German defenses, cross the Rhine, and strike into the industrial heart of Germany. Operation Market Garden was everything Montgomery had argued for. A concentrated thrust, a surgical strike, a bold gamble that could shorten the war by months. It was the operation that had been given supply priority over George Patton's advance. It was the plan that was supposed to vindicate Montgomery's strategic vision. It would become one of the greatest disasters of the Western European campaign. The concept was elegant in theory. Airborne forces would capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, creating a corridor through the Netherlands. British XXX Corps would then drive up this corridor, a single road through difficult terrain, link up with the paratroopers, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and sweep into Germany. Montgomery called it a 90% success before it even began. His confidence was absolute. The Germans were defeated, disorganized, incapable of mounting serious resistance. Speed and audacity would carry the day. George Patton, when he heard the plan, was scathing. "Monty's trying to be like me," he said. "But he doesn't have the touch for it." The criticism wasn't entirely fair, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. From the beginning, Market Garden violated the principles of Montgomery's own methodical approach. Intelligence reports suggested German armor in the Arnhem area, exactly where the British 1st Airborne would drop. These reports were dismissed. Concerns about the narrow single road that XXX Corps would have to advance on, easily blocked, easily defended, were waved aside. The timetable was impossibly tight, requiring everything to work perfectly. And when has everything ever worked perfectly in war? The American airborne divisions, dropping closer to the start line, achieved their objectives. The 101st Airborne captured most of the bridges at Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne, after fierce fighting, secured the massive bridge at Nijmegen. These were extraordinary achievements, paratroopers lightly armed and isolated behind enemy lines, seizing and holding crucial objectives against German counterattacks. But at Arnhem, the bridge too far, everything went wrong. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped too far from their objective. German resistance was far stronger than anticipated. The radios didn't work properly, preventing coordination. And most critically, 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the exact area where British paratroopers landed. Instead of facing demoralized Wehrmacht units, British paratroopers found themselves fighting elite German armor and infantry. What was supposed to be a rapid seizure of the bridge turned into a desperate defensive battle. Only one battalion managed to reach the bridge at Arnhem itself, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion, and they held on with incredible courage for days, waiting for relief that would never come. XXX Corps, advancing up the single road, ran into exactly the problems that skeptics had predicted. German forces blocked the road. British tanks couldn't maneuver off the narrow highway into the soft Dutch polder land. Every German 88mm gun covering the road became a killing zone. Progress was measured in yards, then feet, then not at all. The weather turned. Supply drops fell into German hands. Casualties mounted. And at Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel Frost's paratroopers, out of ammunition, out of medical supplies, surrounded by German armor, finally surrendered after holding the bridge for 4 days. The British 1st Airborne Division was destroyed. Of 10,000 men who dropped at Arnhem, only 2,000 made it back across the Rhine. 8,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a catastrophe. And George Patton, sitting on the Moselle River with his Third Army halted for lack of supplies, watched it unfold with a mixture of vindication and fury. "I told them," he wrote in his diary, "I told them it was a bad plan. But they gave Montgomery the fuel and the priority, and now look." His anger wasn't just about being proven right, it was about the waste. 8,000 British paratroopers lost. Weeks of time lost. And worst of all, the opportunity to end the war in 1944 squandered on an operation that never should have been approved. But George Patton's response revealed his own blind spots. He focused on Montgomery's failure while ignoring the complexity of the situation. Market Garden failed for many reasons. Overconfidence, poor intelligence, bad luck with German unit positions, impossible timetables. But it also failed because of the exact problem plaguing the entire Allied command: insufficient resources spread across competing operations. If Market Garden had received the overwhelming force that Montgomery's methodical approach usually demanded, if every available tank, every artillery piece, every supply truck had been dedicated to making it succeed, would the outcome have been different? We'll never know, because Eisenhower tried to compromise, give Montgomery his operation, but don't completely starve other fronts. The result was an operation with just enough resources to fail dramatically. Bradley watched Market Garden with his own complex emotions. Part of him sympathized with Montgomery. Bold operations sometimes fail, and failure in warfare doesn't always indicate bad planning. But part of him resented that American advances had been halted to support a British operation that now lay in ruins. And part of him worried about George Patton's reaction. Bradley knew George Patton would see Market Garden as proof that he should have been given priority. Bradley knew George Patton would use this failure as ammunition in every future argument about strategy. And Bradley was right to worry. The recriminations began immediately. Montgomery, in a stunning display of denial, declared Market Garden 90% successful, and blamed supply shortages and bad weather for the failure. This infuriated American commanders who had been told to halt their own operations to provide those very supplies. George Patton was brutal in his criticism. "Monty tried to charge like we do," he told his staff, "but he doesn't have the instinct for it. He planned it like one of his set-piece battles, but wanted to execute it like one of our pursuits. He failed at both." British commanders defended Montgomery fiercely. The operation had been audacious, they argued, and audacity requires accepting risk. The Americans, comfortable in their overwhelming material superiority, could afford to criticize. But Britain had been fighting for 5 years with limited resources, and bold strokes were necessary. The cultural divide widened into a chasm. American officers saw Market Garden as proof that British military thinking was outdated, that Montgomery's reputation was inflated, that American methods were superior. British officers saw American criticism as ungracious, as ignoring American failures, as typical of the arrogant newcomers who thought they could win the war alone. And in the middle, Eisenhower struggled to keep the alliance from fragmenting completely. He couldn't publicly criticize Montgomery without causing a political crisis with Churchill and British public opinion. He couldn't ignore the American anger without losing credibility with his own commanders. So he did what he had done throughout the campaign. He tried to mediate, to smooth over, to keep everyone working together even as they seethed with resentment. But something had broken. Market Garden wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a rupture in the command structure that never fully healed. George Patton never missed an opportunity to reference it. In every meeting where Montgomery argued for caution or proper preparation, George Patton would mention Arnhem. In every debate about resource allocation, George Patton would remind everyone what happened when Montgomery was given priority. It was petty, it was unprofessional, and it was devastatingly effective. Montgomery, for his part, became even more defensive about his methods. He doubled down on his criticism of American cowboy tactics. He insisted that his methodical approach was vindicated by every battle except the one where he had tried to be bold. The irony was bitter. Montgomery failed when he tried to fight like George Patton, and George Patton never let him forget it. But beneath the personal rivalry, beneath the national pride and wounded egos, there was a more fundamental question. How much of Market Garden's failure was due to the command conflicts that had plagued Allied operations since North Africa? If George Patton had been given full supply priority in early September, would his advance have succeeded in reaching Germany? Or would his army have overextended and been vulnerable to the exact kind of German counterattack that would come later at the Battle of the Bulge? If Montgomery's narrow thrust concept had been fully supported, if Eisenhower had made the tough call to concentrate everything on Market Garden, would it have succeeded? Or were the operational problems too fundamental to overcome regardless of resources? If the Allied commanders had been able to agree on a unified strategy instead of competing for resources and glory, could the war have ended in 1944? The questions haunted everyone involved. Bradley would spend decades defending his decisions. Montgomery would write memoirs justifying his strategy. Eisenhower would face criticism from both sides, too cautious for the aggressive commanders, too willing to take risks for those who valued careful preparation. But for the 8,000 British and Polish paratroopers who died, were wounded, or were captured at Arnhem, the questions were irrelevant. They had done their jobs with extraordinary courage. They had held positions against impossible odds. They had fought with the skill and determination that made Allied victory possible. And they had been failed by commanders who couldn't put aside ego and rivalry long enough to give them the support they needed. Market Garden stands as a monument to what happens when command conflicts override military judgment. It was launched too quickly because Montgomery wanted to prove his boldness. It was under-resourced because Eisenhower couldn't choose between competing strategies. It was criticized too harshly by George Patton because he saw it as vindication for his own approach. And soldiers died because generals couldn't agree. In the Dutch town of Oosterbeek, near Arnhem, there is a cemetery where many of those paratroopers are buried. Row after row of white headstones, mostly young men, mostly in their 20s, who dropped from the sky and never came home. The cemetery doesn't mention Market Garden's operational failures. It doesn't reference the command conflicts or the supply debates or the personal rivalries. It simply honors the men who fought. But anyone who understands the history, who knows about the fuel crisis that preceded the operation, who comprehends the ego-driven decisions that shaped it, cannot walk through that cemetery without asking, how many of these men would be alive if the generals had been fighting the Germans instead of fighting each other? Market Garden was supposed to end the war. Instead, it ensured the war would continue through a brutal winter, through the Battle of the Bulge, through the final desperate defense of Germany. It squandered time, resources, and most tragically, the lives of some of the finest soldiers in the Allied armies. And it proved that the war inside the war, the conflict between George Patton, Montgomery, and the other Allied generals, was nearly as dangerous as the actual enemy. The Dutch would remember the paratroopers' courage for generations. But they would also remember the failure, and the sense that somewhere, in rooms far from the battlefield, decisions had been made for the wrong reasons. When egos collide, soldiers die. Market Garden proved it beyond any doubt. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Winter. At 5:30 in the morning, the darkness erupted with fire. German artillery hammered American positions along an 85-mile front that had been considered quiet, a rest sector where green divisions could gain experience and battered divisions could recover. The Americans never saw it coming. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was Hitler's desperate gamble. Take 3 armies, over 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks, secretly concentrate them in the Ardennes, and strike where the Allies least expected. Drive through weak American defenses, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital supply port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two. Force a negotiated peace in the West, then turn all German strength against the Soviets. It was audacious. It was desperate. And for the first few days it was terrifyingly successful. German panzers smashed through American lines. Entire units were surrounded and destroyed. Communication broke down. Headquarters lost track of battalions, regiments, divisions. The weather was so bad that Allied air power, the decisive advantage that had dominated every battle since Normandy, was grounded. And at the critical crossroads town of Bastogne, American forces were about to be surrounded. Bastogne wasn't much, a small Belgian market town where 7 roads converged. But those roads were everything. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. If the Germans took it, their panzers could spread out, exploit the breakthrough, drive toward the Meuse. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units, found themselves racing to reach Bastogne before the Germans did. They won the race barely. By December 20th, the paratroopers were dug in around the town. And by December 21st, they were completely surrounded. In conference rooms and headquarters, panic was setting in. The German offensive was massive, unexpected, and succeeding. American forces were reeling backward. The weather prevented aerial resupply or reconnaissance. Nobody knew exactly where German spearheads were or how deep they had penetrated. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of his senior commanders at Verdun on December 19. The mood was grim. Bradley's forces had been split by the German attack. Montgomery would take temporary command of American forces north of the breakthrough, a decision that would create its own controversy later. The immediate question was, how do we stop this? George Patton walked into that conference room with a plan already formed in his mind. While other generals were still processing the shock, still trying to understand the scope of the disaster, George Patton had been studying maps and calculating distances. His Third Army was over 100 miles south of the breakthrough, engaged in its own offensive toward the Saar. To disengage from that battle, wheel north, and strike the German southern flank would require moving an entire army 90 degrees across icy winter roads with minimal preparation. It should have been impossible. When can you attack? Eisenhower asked. December 22nd, George Patton said. 3 days. The room fell silent. Other commanders thought he was joking or grandstanding or insane. Move 3 divisions 100 miles in winter conditions, disengage from active combat, reorient completely, and launch a coordinated attack in 72 hours? Logistics officers would need weeks just to plan such a movement. Don't be fatuous, George, Eisenhower said. But George Patton wasn't joking. He had already issued preliminary orders. His staff had been planning this exact contingency, not because they expected the German offensive, but because George Patton always planned for contingencies. He was ready to move because he was always ready to move. This time the Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder, George Patton said, his voice confident and hard. And this time I've got hold of the handle. He understood immediately what others were slower to grasp. The German offensive was both a crisis and an opportunity. Yes, American forces were in danger. But German armies were now exposed, concentrated, extended beyond their supply lines. If George Patton could hit them from the south while they were focused north, he could cut into their flank, relieve Bastogne, and turn Hitler's gamble into a catastrophic defeat. The Third Army began moving on December 20th. What followed was one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. Over 133,000 vehicles traveled over icy roads. 3 entire divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, the 80th Infantry, disengaged from combat, turned north, and began moving toward the Ardennes. Supply dumps were relocated. Artillery units displaced. Communication lines were rerouted. Fuel convoys were redirected. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. George Patton drove his commanders with the same relentless energy he always had. Sleep was optional. Excuses were unacceptable. Traffic jams were solved by officers physically directing vehicles at intersections. When roads became impassable with ice, engineers worked around the clock to clear them. On December 22nd, exactly when George Patton had promised, the Third Army attacked northward into the German southern flank. The weather was brutal. Soldiers fought in sub-zero temperatures. Weapons froze. Men suffered frostbite by the thousands. The snow was so deep that infantry struggled to advance. German resistance was fanatical. They knew what losing Bastogne would mean. But George Patton's army kept pushing. Day after day, mile after mile, his forces ground northward toward the surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was running out of everything. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Food was scarce. The wounded lay in cellars and churches, suffering without adequate care. German forces surrounded them completely, attacking repeatedly, demanding surrender. When German officers delivered an ultimatum demanding the Americans surrender or be annihilated, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the Bastogne defense, gave a one-word response that entered American military legend: nuts. The paratroopers held. They held through artillery bombardments, through armor attacks, through infantry assaults. They held because they were the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, and they didn't surrender. But they also held because they believed relief was coming. George Patton had promised to reach them. And George Patton always kept his promises about attacking. On December 26, the weather cleared enough for a massive air drop. C-47 transport planes, protected by fighters, dropped supplies to the surrounded garrison. It bought time, but everyone knew time was running out. The Germans were bringing up more forces, preparing for a final assault to crush Bastogne before relief arrived. That same day, December 26, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding a tank task force, smashed through German defensive positions and reached the surrounded paratroopers. The siege was broken. Bastogne was relieved. The impact was electric. What had seemed like a catastrophic American defeat was turning into an American victory. The German offensive, which had shocked the Allied command and threatened to split their armies, had been stopped. And George Patton, difficult, controversial, insubordinate George Patton, had pulled off what military analysts would call impossible. He had moved an entire army 100 miles in winter, executed a complex pivot while maintaining combat effectiveness, and delivered exactly what he promised exactly when he promised it. For Eisenhower, it was vindication of his decision to keep George Patton despite all the headaches. No other American general could have done what George Patton did at Bastogne. The speed, the audacity, the sheer force of will required to execute that movement, it required George Patton's unique combination of tactical genius and aggressive temperament. Bradley, who had often been frustrated by George Patton's insubordination and demands, watched the Bastogne relief with complex emotions. Pride in American forces. Gratitude for George Patton's achievement. But also a nagging question. If George Patton could perform miracles like this, why was managing him so difficult the rest of the time? Even Montgomery, never generous with praise for American commanders, acknowledged the achievement. Though he couldn't resist adding that proper defensive positions would have prevented the crisis in the first place. A comment that infuriated American officers who pointed out that Montgomery's own forces in the north had failed to counterattack effectively. But for George Patton himself, Bastogne was personal vindication. This was what he had been arguing for all along: speed, aggression, faith in mobility and shock action. While others had talked about caution and proper preparation, he had proven again that audacity wins battles. His soldiers, exhausted and frostbitten, knew they had accomplished something extraordinary. The Third Army had earned its reputation as the fastest, most aggressive army in Europe. And they had done it not in summer sunshine across French countryside, but in winter darkness through Belgian forests against desperate German resistance. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks. There would be more fighting, more casualties, more moments of crisis. But Bastogne was the turning point. The German offensive had been stopped, their best divisions were now trapped in a salient where they could be destroyed, and the strategic initiative had passed back to the Allies. George Patton had saved the day. And for a brief moment, the war inside the war paused. The conflicts over strategy and resources, the personal rivalries and wounded egos, all of it took a back seat to simple military necessity and George Patton's undeniable genius in mobile warfare. It wouldn't last. Within weeks, the old tensions would resurface. But Bastogne stood as proof of what George Patton could accomplish when his abilities were properly utilized. It was his finest hour, the moment when everything that made him difficult also made him indispensable. In the frozen forests around Bastogne, there are memorials to the paratroopers who held the line and the tankers who broke the siege. And every military officer who studies that battle must confront the same truth. Sometimes you need a general who can do the impossible. Sometimes you need someone who refuses to accept limitations, who demands more than seems reasonable, who believes that willpower and speed can overcome any obstacle. Sometimes you need George Patton. The question facing Allied command for the rest of the war would be, how do you harness the genius without letting it destroy the coalition it's meant to defend? Bastogne provided no answer to that question. It simply proved that the question mattered. Germany is collapsing. The road to Berlin is open. Patton wants to finish it. Fast, decisive, final. But orders come down, stop at the Elbe. Politics has entered the war. Allies think about borders, balance, tomorrow. Patton thinks about enemies. About what happens if the Soviets are not stopped now. Anger spills into words. Words into headlines. Headlines into trouble. The war Patton understands is ending. A new one, quiet, political, dangerous, has already begun. And Patton is losing it. Patton was built for motion. Coalitions are built for compromise. A democratic war needs patience. It needs restraint. It needs generals who think beyond the battlefield. Patton never did. Others slowed wars to keep alliances alive. Patton wanted speed, even if it shattered unity. Was he wrong? No. Was he right? Not fully. The truth is harder. Patton was a weapon. Weapons are decisive. But they are also dangerous, especially to those holding them. December 1945. No guns. No orders. No enemies. A simple car accident ends the life of a man who survived every battlefield. War spared him. Peace did not. Patton is buried among his soldiers. Not above them. With them. His genius is studied. His temper debated. His legacy unsettled. Patton did not win the war alone. But without him it would not have been the same. Some men are born for war. And when war ends, so do they.